All right, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is directed by Michael Chavez, and it stars Patrick Wilson, Vera Farmiga, Roy O'Connor, Sarah Catherine Hook, Julian Hilliard, and many others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, it is about...
Okay, now I cannot help but laugh at that.
It is about the Warrens who investigate a murder that may be linked to a demonic possession. As we noted in the intro, say what you will about the title, but it is inspired by a real case that has historically been dubbed the Devil Made Me Do It case.
Yeah.
So it is appropriate, regardless of what we think of it. But let's get into the quality of the film. Again, the third in the Conjuring trilogy. There are spin-offs, but this is the third film in the Conjuring trilogy specifically. So, Brendan, what did you think about The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It?
Can you just say it like that every single time now? Yeah. You have to. I mean, I think the devil's going to make you do it at this point now.
Absolutely.
But you're right. This is the third Conjuring film as far as the third film with the Conjuring name attached to it. But there are, I think, 8 movies in this Conjuring universe, if you want to call it that. And this is also not the third time that the Warrens, Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, have showed up. They were also in Annabelle Comes Home, which I have not seen.
Yeah.
But I will say... like almost everyone out there within our film critic circle, at least, I did have my doubts about this movie, knowing it was not directed by James Wan, and I don't like to go into movies with that mindset. I'm hoping to be pleased and surprised, especially given who's directing it. I mostly like the first film that James Wan directed. I especially like that second one, The Conjuring 2, which seems to be an island that I own all to myself, and I'm okay with that. To put it simply, I do like those first 2 films. I don't think they're perfect, but I think they're pretty good and effective horror films that do have a mainstream appeal to them. Now, when it comes to The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, I do think this movie starts off very well, especially in its first third. Not just in its opening exorcism scene, which is mostly effective, but the fact that the film gets that right out of the way in the opening minutes. We aren't building towards one again, like we were in the first 2. And it essentially makes this promise that this third Conjuring film is going to be different than the other 2, perhaps one that takes its historical context more seriously. I don't think it keeps that promise, though. The idea that this film is going more in the vein of a murder mystery or courtroom drama rather than demonic possession movie, I think that's fascinating, especially given how famous the case of Arnie Johnson was.
Yeah.
It just doesn't feel like Michael Chavez and screenwriter David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick know how to blend those genres together. And much of what follows just feels like demonic possession wheel spinning to me, as if they didn't know where to take this story. It's a film that feels like it wants to be a new and different approach, yet it is still obligated to be a Conjuring film. And it's that balance that just feels so off by the midpoint to the end. And it's disappointing because, like I said earlier, I do think the film does start off pretty well. I actually really like Roy O'Connor as Arnie. And Michael Chavez, at first, I think is utilizing some pretty interesting horror tactics. I think there are some really quiet uses of jump scares that I found mostly effective in those opening minutes. But once the Warrens are front and center and the central mystery begins, the film just spins its wheels and becomes a string of tedious jump scares for me. And I felt annoyed by the end because of that.
Yeah, I think that is very fair. A lot of people seem to be sharing that sentiment. Before I get into my thoughts, a little bit of context that I actually really liked that first Conjuring film back in 2013. It was one of the best surprises of that year for me, especially because at that time, I wasn't nearly as much of a fan of horror as I am now. I've really grown to love the genre since 2013. But
I mean, you're still a scaredy cat, but you appreciate the genre a lot more now.
Very much so. I'm much more willing to embrace horror now versus in 2013,
right.
Which is a big reason it was a nice surprise. Now, The Conjuring 2, I'm not nearly as big a fan of as Brennan. As he noted, he's more on that island by himself, which is fair. I love that you own that hipster role very well. That is one of
It's
your
not
best
it's not a
critics.
hipster role. I just found that film very moving and silly in ways that I think it's well balanced.
I'm mostly just joking there, but yeah, I'm not a big fan of it, although I do like some of it. I like its drama. It's more so less effective as a horror film for me compared to that first
That's
film.
fair. Yeah, and the drama is what saves it for me.
And very understandable. As for The Devil Made Me Do It, I think this is perfectly fine. It is adequate. I don't think it's actively bad, but it's far from great at the same time. Now, as we just mentioned and joked about, I wouldn't call myself a horror aficionado by any means, so take it for what it's worth, I guess, but I think this film is quintessentially okay. It's more or less a James Wan imitation.
Yeah.
Or at least it's trying to be. But it never comes close to reaching the heights of Wan from the previous two films. In terms of its aesthetics, the editing of the film, the way Michael Chavez uses the camera to build suspense, much of it felt familiar to this franchise, but it's not quite as effective. It's not as rigorous or deft. I do think there are some good things here, though. Many will disagree with me, I'm sure, but the film wonderfully gives away much of its scares. And as Brendan noted, I'm a scaredy cat, so I appreciated that. All joking aside, the craft in Chavez's direction is effective in places, such as the moment early on in the film. And this is in the trailer, so this isn't much of a spoiler. But the moment when Arnie has that first kill, leading to that moment in the trailer that you mentioned last week, Brendan, when he's confronted by the cop on an open road.
Yeah.
Which is ominous on its own. But that moment in the house prior to when the cop shows up was very reminiscent of Juan in the previous two films, I think.
Yeah.
Or, as you noted in your opening thoughts, Brennan, the very opening of the film and the exorcism we see there, which is not only daunting as a horror film and very complimentary to the first two Conjuring films, but there's a nice, tender moment between Arnie and David to help build emotion into the drama. And that's exactly what makes the first two as good as they are. James Wan was great at making them as much a family drama as they were horror. Now, I do think that becomes muddled in the film as it goes, but that opening sequence found the right balance. And aesthetically, it's well shot and chilling to watch, although part of it for me is my own fatherhood, which I could not separate.
That's
and
fair.
Watching young child imperiled like that was moving. But I also think the filmmaking brought credence to those emotions. So yes, I would argue there are some good, maybe even great individual scenes or sequences that render pulsating tension and bleakness. But
I agree.
On the whole, the storytelling isn't quite as compendious compared to its predecessors. And thematically, I found the film quite confusing, which I do want to get more into as we go here.
I actually found it kind of empty thematically, honestly.
I do think
I'm
there's
not really
some
sure.
interesting ideas. I'll get to it, but I think the film is very confused. Again, I didn't dislike it. In fact, I do love some of what's here on paper, but in execution, it's trying to imitate James Wan instead of being its own thing. And that ultimately suffocates the overall experience.
It honestly makes me kind of curious to check out Michael Chavez's first film, The Curse of La Llorona, which I believe is also set in this universe, because with this, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, it's kind of hard to tell where Michael Chavez's own sensibilities begin and where the James Wan imitator ends. It's really difficult.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And because there is such a sense of imitation here, and weirdly, the stuff that I think I like the most, the opening sequence, the stuff in the first act when Michael Chavez takes his time to build the jump scares by relishing in the quiet. A lot of those tactics are also present in those first two Conjuring films and were somewhat developed by James Wan within this universe. So it's hard to give Michael Chavez credit for that then. But I do think they are still somewhat effective here, primarily because, like with most of these other movies in this universe, especially The Conjuring 2, the subject that is being possessed is usually giving the best performance in this movie. I really like Rory O'Connor here as Arnie Johnson. And I like the way that the demon takes hold of him, more so manipulating him to do cruel things that he may have always been capable of, rather than, I guess, just making him do evil things. It's almost like this psychological form of demonic possession in some ways, which I found really interesting. And for a while, I thought this film was going to be more about Arnie than the Warrens, given how famous this case was.
Yeah.
And that kind of felt refreshing, honestly. For a moment, I was reminded of, remember that movie, The Exorcism of Emily Rose? A film I don't particularly love, but I think it would have been a neat approach for this universe. But instead, it gets shoved in the background to make room for Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga once again, who, for the first time, feel mostly checked out here, if you ask me. I kind of got this sense that they were less interested in portraying these characters this time around, and that made it so unfortunate given how famous that this case actually is.
Well, that is very interesting for reasons I'm about to get into. Now, before I do want to echo what you were saying about Arnie and his involvement in this film, because the performance by Rory O'Connor is very good, particularly with what you're talking about as far as him being possessed, being forced to do something against his will. And that is very much on the table. It's very overt in that. And it's very interesting to me because of the performance. Now, ultimately, much of it is bogged down because of the storytelling in terms of, does this want to be a murder mystery? Is it going to eventually turn into a courtroom drama? Is it going to be a conventional Conjuring film? It wants to be all of those things, and then in the end is none of them, which is unfortunate because the Arnie
not very
character
well
is
balanced.
I agree. There's another element to Arnie I want to get to here in a moment, but first I want to talk about Ed and Lorraine, and it's really interesting with what you're talking about with the performances. I don't know if I share that, but I find that interesting in terms of what this film is wanting to be thematically and how confusing I think it is, which is my biggest issue with the film. It doesn't seem to know what it wants to be or what it wants to be about. It's ultimately an amalgamation of a few different ideas that are thinly veiled. With Ed and Lorraine, a lot of this film is about their relationship and their deep connection to one another. An idea that on its own terms is affable enough, but aside from seeing their bond in previous films and in little bits here, there's one scene early on when Lorraine talks about how they first met. And that one moment is supposed to be the foundation for a payoff that comes in the film's climax.
Yep.
I don't know if it's enough, but I love this interesting dichotomy that the plot, the narrative of the film, centers around an evil connection that tethers two horrible murders that revolve around demonic possession and creating havoc and chaos. As the investigation unfolds, Ed and Lorraine get caught up in that specific connection, meaning that at some point in the film, the connectivity of the curse is interrupted by a connection of love between Ed and Lorraine. There's intersecting paths between that polarity of love and evil. And on paper, as sappy as that may be, I kind of like that, but I don't know if it works in execution. The film doesn't devote enough time to it for those ideas to be fully realized. Now, I do appreciate that it's not overt. The film isn't calling direct attention to that dichotomy, so I appreciate the subtlety, but at the same time, it's lacking connective tissue.
Yeah, well, it does make for a pretty interesting and ironic idea that this relationship between Ed and Lorraine was initially brought together by love, but the thing that keeps them together, their job, is rooted in dissecting evil. And I do kind of like that irony. It's almost like this film is maybe trying to deconstruct their relationship and their jobs, as if to say that what they're doing is almost to the point of obsession. And I think that is a pretty interesting idea. And again, maybe it is just the balancing act by Michael Chavez and the editors here, and even just the screenplay. It does get very expository and rooted in plot more so than I think it should, that some of those ideas perhaps get lost. But I'm not really sure if the performances here by Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga are as connected as they used to be to solve those ideas. I felt that sense of love and connection between them in The Conjuring 2 more than any other film in this universe, primarily because of their performances. A lot of people like to make fun of that Elvis scene in The Conjuring 2, and it is kind of silly when you think about it more deeply, but I still found it kind of moving because I found something very passionate and genuine about it that I think this film wants to still hold on to. I just don't necessarily feel it, and I think that's what emphasizes that confusion that you're talking about there too, because on the page it does feel a little bit unsure of itself with what it's trying to say.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to what the film wants to be fundamentally. Again, going back to, is it going to be a murder mystery? Is it going to be about demons and possession and cults? Or is it eventually going to turn into a court case, which it seems to tease early on in the film, as you noted earlier. But as the film goes, as we get into the investigation, and maybe this is why in some ways I'm okay with the amount of plot that we get here, because the narrative, again, centers around this evil connection as it relates to this cult, this curse that has been planted on this family that relates to another case, another murder case that happens several hundred miles away. And I like that parallel that there's this connection between these curses and how Ed and Lorraine and their connection, their bond of love, how it intersects with that curse. And there's a really interesting moment, symbolically anyway, when Lorraine finds herself in the morgue and she is she's in the tethering, right? And there's a reveal there in terms of the pathways, in terms of it going forwards and backwards. Now, say what you will about how that works from a demonic possession level, but symbolically...
We're no experts on that topic.
No, and it almost doesn't matter. I only bring that up to say that symbolically, that very much relates to Lorraine and Ed, which is why I think that it's mostly there, is to complement their relationship, their connection going both ways, and how it parallels the plot. So I'm okay with that on its own terms. I'm okay with the amount of plot here because it is attempting to mirror Ed and Lorraine. My problem is that it's all undermined by all of these other things that are happening. And for you, it
it's
sounds
spinning
like
its wheels, like I said.
Yeah, and for you, it sounds like the performances as well. Now, I did like the performances. I wasn't as distracted by that here.
Well, I wasn't really distracted. I feel like they're not selling what they're trying to convey this time around.
Which is fair. I guess we'll disagree there. I bought into it enough. Maybe part of it is because of these ideas that I'm talking about and how interesting I find them to be on paper. But it is frustrating. Either way, it doesn't work. It's suffocated because of the overall storytelling.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't dislike the amount of plot here. I guess that's not what I meant to say. What I don't really like is the constant explaining of the plot, because so many characters get bogged down in expository dialogue to keep us, I guess, rooted in what that plot is, and that's what I didn't find as interesting. But the amount of plot is sort of necessary here to try and tether those themes together. There are just other factors that we keep talking about that don't do a good job tethering those ideas together. But you did mention in your opening that there are some things here we perhaps really like, maybe even love about this movie. Let's get to that morgue scene, because that sequence in the morgue, if you ask me, I'm not sure how you feel about it, knowing that you are a big scaredy cat, I found it genuinely creepy. There are some images there, especially involving one body, I'll simply say, and how it moves. I don't want to give too much away. Yeah. It's very haunting. And the way that Chavez decides to linger on that, I mean, it's in that one moment when I realized, okay, this is an R-rated horror film. Because these Conjuring movies don't really relish in the blood and gore that most of these commercial R-rated horror films do. But I actually respect that about them, and yet they still find their R ratings because of how sophisticated that they sometimes come off. And in the case of this film, I don't think it's nearly as sophisticated as the other two, but this sequence here is really enough to push it to that R rating. It's really creepy.
Well, I think much of its sophistication is lost because it's trying to be an imitation.
Right.
But sometimes, even when trying to be an imitation, you do get it right. And as I mentioned in my opening thoughts, I think that moment with Arnie in the apartment when he gets that first kill, I think that's very effective. That's very James Wan-y.
Right.
And that moment in the morgue that you're talking about, I think, is another great example of that. And I'm glad to hear you say that, because in the theater, my freak-out-o-meter was at 11. So I was...
You didn't see it by yourself, did you?
No, I actually saw this with the great Alan French, one of our writers that you can go and check out at InSessionFilm.com. And he was there supporting me and holding me the whole time, which was nice.
That's good. I'm just making sure you're comforted.
But I agree with you. I thought it was very unsettling and very harrowing. I did appreciate the filmmaking tactics there. But again, I didn't know if it was me and how soft I am when it comes to that kind of crap, or if it was genuinely effective. So to hear that from someone like you, that is, it certainly justifies my freak-out-o-meter.
Yeah, and I think it's the aesthetics of it too, because Chavez is not afraid to shy away from the sliminess of it. It's a very grotesque scene physically. It's almost very tangible and visceral in that sense. The sound editing of it all is also very good to make it even that much more effective. And the way it concludes, I'll simply say, as a body hits the floor and the way that the sound reverberates, it's gross, but it's gross in a pretty awesome way for this kind of movie.
Well, and it's also the most frustrating moment of the film for me, because, again, going back to what we were saying earlier about this dichotomy of the tethering of the curse, the connectivity of the curse, and the connectivity of Ed and Lorraine. It's that moment with the body that you're talking about where those two things in a very real way are colliding. And it's really great. Unfortunately, we don't get much of it.
And then it just slams on the ground and ends.
And that's the only time, I guess you can argue the climax as well, but it's a little bit more obvious there and not quite as interesting. And again, even if you want to argue the climax and how similar it is in terms of tactics, a lot of that dichotomy and that relationship of Ed and Lorraine, it's undermined because of all these other things that it's trying to be. And I cannot emphasize enough, aside from seeing these characters in other films, there's one moment early on in the film when Lorraine talks about how they first met. And that is supposed to carry a ton of weight when it comes to the climax and their relationship and what unfolds there. And it's just not enough.
Honestly, the moment that carries the most dramatic weight for me is the moment in the car when she even talks about meeting Elvis, not just before his death, but also after his death, referencing that sequence from The Conjuring 2, as if this movie is aware of what the best scene from the last movie was.
And that's interesting. What did you think of the humor? I don't recall a ton of levity in the previous two Conjuring films. Perhaps that's ignorance on my end. I haven't revisited them in some time. But the levity here, and there are only a few instances of it, but they oddly kind of worked for me. There was that moment you were talking about with Elvis. There's a moment they have with the police officer and turning the car around. My favorite, though, is the Annabelle Lawyer Gag, which I found hilarious. And I think it works for me because the levity in this film aren't jokes, but rather it's using horror ironically. So tonally, it doesn't feel jarring.
It's a self-awareness to the horror at play. This film actually has a really funny jump cut that I couldn't help but think about when Ed and Lorraine meet with that lawyer for the first time, explaining that they want her to bring up demonic possession as a way of defending Arnie Johnson. And she says she won't do it. And then it instantly cuts to her in the courtroom, and the look on her face.
That's what I meant by the lawyer Annabelle gag.
It is hilarious.
That is so good.
But it's hilarious in a good way that it almost feels like the movie is aware of what it's trying to commentate on. And I guess in some ways I kind of would have liked to see more of that.
I agree. That would have been great. I don't know if it would have undermined some of the tension and drama here, but the way it was utilized in that moment and some of the others we've referenced already, I do think it's effective, but it is far and few in between. All right, before we get to final thoughts, one more quick note, going back to this film feeling thematically confused. And this is the element of the film that revolves around Arnie. We mentioned earlier that he's possessed and the performance there from O'Connor, very good in tapping into that. But earlier in the film, in that opening scene specifically, Arnie demonstrates this initial courage that I find really compelling when he brazenly calls out the demon that is possessing David, straight up calls him a coward. And there are consequences to his actions there.
Right.
But the compassion that he shows, it's not only affable, it's genuinely moving. Yeah. There is something to be said about Arnie that he would take on that sacrifice. But as the film goes from there, again, going back to the criticisms we've talked about, it gets bogged down by plot and scares to do anything interesting with that. Really, the only consequences that play out are all narrative driven. Yeah. Amped up by a great performance, but it's mostly narrative driven, with Arnie suffering in his jail cell at the hands of the curse. At one point, the demon tries to take over and create havoc physically, and then there's all the stuff that happens in the climax. None of that examines the choice he made at the beginning of the film as it relates to his bravery. And in the end, the last thing we see is what happens to him at the end of the court case. It's borderline egregious to me that this is neglected. That idea on paper is really, really fascinating. The fact that he would take a demon from a child so he could be free from the suffering is incredible. I love that. And it's really unfortunate that it becomes nothing in the end.
Well, this is my biggest problem with the movie, is that this specific Conjuring movie feels to have the least amount of respect for the real life story it is referencing, because it basically just turns it into background noise for a series of jump scares by the end. Because that really is a great idea. And as I said in my opening thoughts, Rory O'Connor as Arnie might give my favorite performance in the movie, at least because of that first third. I think he is very convincing and very moving in those sequences.
Yeah, for sure.
And then Arnie is simply just relegated to a possessed object, basically, is all he's relegated to. And that is borderline offensive given those really great notions.
I agree. The performance inside all of that, as we've said, is good. But I do wish the film did more with what it set up, because that moment he has with David is so tender and lovely and warming. And he does something very courageous, something that Ed and Lorraine seemingly haven't done as many good things as they have done, arguably. But for him to just become that possessed thing that you're talking about is frustrating. And this is in addition to the Ed and Lorraine stuff that could have been interesting if that was handled more diligently. So again, the film just seems very confused. It doesn't know what it wants to be. And thus,
I agree.
You get good individual moments, but on the whole, it's sliced and diced to hell.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, let's get to final thoughts. We'll go back to you, Brennan. Any concluding thoughts here on The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It?
You said that one a little bit differently. I was hoping for the devil voice, the devilish voice from you.
Do it.
All right, that's better. That's much better. I'll take that one. I guess only two final thoughts from me. I'll keep this brief. But speaking to the performances, we get a brief moment here, actually two brief moments here with John Noble as the character of Kastner, I'll simply say. And I won't reveal how his character plays into the film's climax, but he is very good in this movie as well, giving a very bit performance, but certainly seems to be aware of the type of movie that he's in. And we certainly like to give actors credit for knowing the kind of movies that they're in, especially for genre films like this, because it's a lot harder to do that for, honestly, just to really just get that balance right. And I think he's certainly more self-aware of it than most other people here, and I really like his work here. As far as my last final thought, JD, and this is not really a big problem with the movie as a whole, but it's one minor moment that sort of frustrated me quite heavily. It's sort of one of those like plot hole-ish kind of moments.
Okay.
So at one point in the movie, Arnie is put on suicide watch because he is at danger of hurting himself, or this demon is at danger of making him hurt himself. So what happens afterwards is the prison's own priest comes over, takes pity on him, and gives him a glass of holy water to protect himself with.
Mm-hmm.
A glass of holy water, one you can easily break and cut yourself with. Is that the stupidest thing a character has done in a movie in quite some time?
Yes, I very much see what you're saying. I think what the film was trying to do, because prior to that moment, Ed tells the Debbie character to get with the priest and put him on suicide watch. So when the priest shows up there, to me, and maybe this is also just the performance, because the priest seemed to have a sense of urgency as to be aware that something is very wrong with Arnie. And so here's something to protect yourself with, not thinking that Arnie himself is in trouble, understanding that it's not Arnie who's in control of Arnie, that the priest has an understanding that it's something else that's in control of him. So here's something to protect yourself with. That's how I interpreted that.
Yeah.
But on its own, without that context, and maybe without that performance, I guess, I can very much see what you're saying, because on its face, it doesn't make any sense at all.
I got the sense that that priest was actually aware of the situation. And if that is the case, then it really is a very questionable decision. But I don't know. It could just be my misinterpretation of it.
I do think he is aware of him being on quote-unquote suicide watch, but I think
do you think... I think is also aware of him being dangerously possessed.
Yes, which is, I think, what justifies that moment, because, again, because he's possessed, it's not Arnie who is on suicide watch. Does that make sense? Because Arnie isn't in control of Arnie.
But wouldn't you think that whatever is in control of Arnie would think, oh, here's a weapon, here's something sharp, I'm going to kill my subject with this. It's just that's where I'm thinking about it. It's just like the point of putting someone on suicide watch is to prevent them from getting access to any type of dangerous object. And here is a potentially dangerous object if it's smashed and broken in the right way. And that's what I'm getting at.
I'm just trying to, I guess, think about it the way the priest would in the moment, because I agree with you. It is a bit of an odd choice, but I guess if I'm looking at it from his perspective, he's thinking that here's something that will protect Arnie. Arnie isn't Arnie anymore. He's possessed by something entirely, but this is something that can protect him, not really thinking about the fact that it's a glass bottle, I guess. And maybe that's an oversight. I don't know.
I don't know either, but I couldn't help but think about that even in the moment when it happened. It is a
contrivance. Either way, it's certainly a film contrivance.
And I hate to use the word stupid or even dumb when talking about anything. I feel like that's incredibly unfair and sometimes even very childish, but I couldn't help but think about the actions of that priest and thinking, I don't think that's the smartest move, man. I really don't.
But I guess for me, maybe what saves it is his intentions. Because again, he is very aware. He's aware of the dangers at play. Here's something that can protect him from this demon, or at least that's how he sees it. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense of urgency there. So you get the sense that he cares about Arnie, that he wants the best for him, not thinking that the glass bottle would eventually be used against him.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about the minutia of how that all works to know if anything could have been transferred in a different way. But
I don't know.
Needless to say, it's just one thing I noticed
bag.
and thought. I mean, again, I don't know. I mean, is the plastic bag blessed enough to be to be warranted in that situation? I don't know. I haven't been to Catholic school in so many years. But anyway, the point I'm making is that this one small moment that lasts about 25 seconds is the reason why I don't like this movie. That's what I'm simply saying. I'm totally kidding. But to get to my final thoughts, it's just that out of these 3 movies in the Conjuring trilogy, this is easily my least favorite. And if they are going to continue this, because I do like these characters, I do like Ed and Lorraine Warren as portrayed by Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, maybe not as much in this movie because of the material surrounding them. Mm-hmm. I just hope that they have a filmmaker that just has a better handle on horror balancing. Doesn't have to be James Wan, just someone that has a better handle on the balancing that we keep talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's all very fair. I guess my priest glass moment in this film revolves around the Kastner character played by John Noble, who is a former priest himself, someone when he was working in the field had investigated these occults for years. And so he's a quote unquote expert that Ed and Lorraine are coming to find information that helps them with their investigation.
Right.
And the initial moment, a little bit harrowing in some ways, given how it ends. And there's a little bit of ambiguity in Noble's performance. But it's one of those horror movie or maybe just general movie tropes that is a bit frustrating for me in the sense that he can't just be a guy that helps Ed and Lorraine.
Right.
That eventually things are going to circle back to him because of course it does.
Oh yeah. Now let me say, as much as I like his performance, and I think he's great here, I don't necessarily love the writing of the character.
The writing of it becomes a bit on the nose and just a bit too extreme given the details. It's not even that he comes back into the fold. It's the specific details of the character at the end is frustrating to me. It is a bit frustrating,
especially when they get revealed at that point and not earlier somewhere that could have saved all this trouble.
Exactly. It's very tedious. I did not really care for at all. And that's another thing to add to the list of frustrations I had with this film. On top of the constant undermining the film does within the narrative, jumping around with all these different elements, as we talked about earlier, which is frustrating. And I know that many horror fans out there will be frustrated by the tedious jump scares, as you talked about earlier. Now, I will say, while this film does get bogged down in needing to be a horror film, it certainly goes out of its way to contrive that sense of dread and anticipation so that it can deliver those jump scares. In fact, this wasn't a direct moment of levity, but it was really funny to me where there's a moment between Ed and Lorraine and one of their assistants. You know, they're trying to find some information that will lead them to, you know, the occultist that is behind this curse.
Right.
And the scene takes place early in the morning or midday. And they say something to the effect of, okay, we have all day to find this information and we need to do it before nightfall because at night, that's when she's at her most powerful. And then the next cut is them doing that research and it's all at night. Like it's not during the day at all.
I wonder if that was an oversight. It almost sounds like unintentional comedy.
Well, to me, it's just one of those things of, okay, we have to make sure that we contrive as much horror as humanly possible. Yeah. Even if it doesn't make sense narratively at all.
Yeah, because we all know nighttime is certainly scarier than the daytime.
Yeah, exactly. And there are just things like that in this film, you know, where we're contriving horror because we need to, because this is ultimately a horror film and we got to get butts in the seats and we need those jump scares, you know, and I get it. I certainly get it. That's what a lot of fans want to see. And as I noted in my opening thoughts, even though I do think the film does a good job, good is certainly subjective, I guess. It certainly teases its scares, you know, when they're coming. And that's a good thing for someone like me, you know, because I was already in that anticipation. There was nothing in this film that came out of nowhere.
Right.
You know, like that opening scene in A Quiet Place Part 2, the first time we get the monster and it kind of comes out of nowhere. We don't get anything like that in this film. Like, when things are coming, for better or worse.
And I will say, I do respect that the lead up to some of these jump scares, not only are they quiet, but sometimes they do take a while, which I do appreciate.
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's also kind of twofold because by doing that, you also know that one is coming. So you're already tensed up for it. You're just tensed up for a much longer period of time waiting for that bomb to blow. So it becomes kind of a double-edged sword in that regard.
Yeah, I very much do agree. So ultimately, I like that. But again, with my subjectivity with horror films, it's hard for me to say fully whether that's effective or not. But I did appreciate how it takes its time, how it shows its cards in some of that. And going back to what we said about the morgue, or even that opening kill, or even the opening exorcism, there is an effectiveness to the filmmaking, I would argue, even outside of my subjectivity, that works. Even if it's an imitation of James Wan, I still think it's certainly effective in those moments. Most of my issues with the film just comes down to how confused it is, dramatically and thematically. So with that, we will have a full written review of this up at InSessionFilm.com. I have thoughts at letterboxd.com/InSessionFilm if you want to continue our thoughts there. And the last thing I'll say, because I didn't mention it a moment ago, completely with you, Brendan, this is easily my least favorite of the trilogy.
Yeah, and I feel like most people feel that way at this point now, and I honestly don't blame them. And for those of you out there, if you agree or disagree with what we just had to say about The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, you can let us know by leaving a comment on our Facebook page at facebook.com/InSessionFilm. You can also tweet us directly at InSessionFilm or respond to us on Instagram. Our handle there is also at InSessionFilm, or you can email us your thoughts in long form at InSessionFilm@gmail.com.
For the entire version of our podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or on Stitcher, or check us out online at InSessionFilm.com.